The cathedral was a sea of white lilies and high society whispers. Do you, Cale Viremont, take Elara Vance to be your lawfully wedded wife? Elara stood there in her simple lace gown, her deep brown skin radiant against the veil. Her heart wasn't just pounding, it was echoing in her throat. This was the man who had seen her, not as a CEO, but as a woman. I do, Cale said, but he didn't stop there. He didn't lean in for the kiss. Instead, Cale stepped back, a cold, arrogant smirk cutting through his sharp jawline. He reached into his tailored dark suit, pulled out his phone and held it toward the microphone. Check your offshore accounts, gentlemen, Cale's voice boomed, dripping with a cruelty she didn't recognize. The bet is settled. I told you the office mouse was an easy target. 6 months of boredom, but a $50,000 payout makes it worth the effort. The church erupted. Not in outrage, but in the sharp, synchronized laughter of men who looked like lions in suits. Phones were raised high, capturing Elara's frozen expression in high definition. She watched the man she loved turn into a stranger before her eyes. You really thought I'd marry an assistant? Cale whispered, leaning close enough for her to smell his expensive cologne one last time. You were a job, Elara, and now, you're just content for the group chat. Elara's legs felt like lead, but she didn't cry. She looked directly into the camera of a nearby phone, her soft eyes turning into shards of ice. What Cale Viremont didn't know, what none of the predators in this room knew, was that he wasn't standing in a church. He was standing in a building she owned, and by tomorrow she would own him too. Hey everyone, before we dive into the fallout of this betrayal, I need you to do something. Drop a comment below with the word revenge if you want to see Cale lose everything. Your engagement keeps these stories coming. And hit that subscribe button because you won't believe the secret Elara is about to reveal. 6 months earlier, the world doesn't see the people who actually run it. They see the flashy suits and the loud voices, but they miss the quiet power in the room. 6 months earlier, Elara Vance stood before a full-length mirror in her penthouse. She wasn't wearing diamonds. She was putting on a simple, off-the-rack blouse and pulling her hair into a neat, professional low bun. She looked like a woman who worried about her rent, which was exactly the point. Her encrypted phone buzzed. The board is restless, Ms. Vance, her CFO's voice crackled. They don't understand why the CEO of Vance Global is working in the filing department. They don't have to understand, Elara replied, her voice calm and authoritative. I want to see who my employees are when they think I am nobody. Keep the car 2 blocks away. 30 minutes later, Elara was walking into the glass and steel monolith of Vance Global. To the world, this was the heart of the city's economy. To Elara, it was her birthright. She took the service elevator to the 12th floor, the logistics department. That's where she first saw him, Cale Viremont. He was standing by the window, his back to the room, looking out at the city like he already owned it. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in a navy suit that cost more than an assistant's yearly salary. He didn't turn when she approached his desk with a stack of files. You're late, Vance, he said, his voice deep and emotionally distant. The elevator was crowded, Mr. Viremont, she lied smoothly. He turned then, his dark brown eyes scanning her with a clinical, predatory intensity. He was a cleaner, brought in to streamline the department. In reality, he was a wolf in the fold, a high-ranking operative for the syndicate sent to find the CEO's weakness. He didn't know that his weakness was currently standing in front of him, holding a stapler. Sit down, Cale commanded, leaning back in his chair. I have a new project for you, and if you do it well, I might make it worth your while. Elara sat, her posture graceful despite her plain clothes. She looked into his cold eyes and felt a flicker of something dangerous. She wanted to know if a man like him could ever be loyal. She was about to find out it was a $50,000 mistake. Elara sat at her cramped desk in the corner of the logistics department. The hum of fluorescent lights a stark contrast to the heavy silence of her penthouse. To the rest of the staff, she was just Elara Vance, the girl who never forgot to refill the coffee pot and always turned her reports in 10 minutes early. Her deep brown skin was glowing under the harsh office lights, though she wore no makeup, and her hair was pulled back so tightly into a low bun that it felt like a physical reminder of the role she was playing. She spent her mornings cross-referencing shipping manifests and responding to mundane emails. It was tedious, repetitive work, but it was the only way she could truly see the cracks in her empire. From the top floor, everything looked perfect. From down here, she could see the waste, the small thefts, and the way the middle managers treated those they deemed beneath them. Her father had built Vance Global with his bare hands, but he had also died surrounded by people who only loved his stock options. On his deathbed, his last words hadn't been about the business. They had been a warning. Elara, find someone who sees the woman, not the bank account. Once they know who you are, y'all never know who they really are. That was why she was here. For 3 months, she had lived a double life. She drove a 10-year-old sedan she parked 3 blocks away, wore sensible shoes that hurt her arches, and ate homemade sandwiches at her desk while her assistants on the 50th floor likely dined on Wagyu beef. She was startled from her thoughts when a stack of files slammed onto her desk. "Vance, I need these digitized by noon," a supervisor barked without looking at her. Elara didn't flinch. She simply nodded, her piercing, intelligent eyes tracking the man as he walked away. He had no idea he was speaking to the woman who signed his paychecks. He had no idea that with one phone call, she could erase his career. There was a strange, cold comfort in the invisibility. She felt safe in the shadows, hidden behind the office mouse persona she had crafted so carefully. She was waiting for a sign, a glimmer of genuine humanity in a world of corporate sharks. Then, the elevator doors at the end of the hall slid open. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing heavy and still. Cale Viremont stepped out, his tall, broad-shouldered frame cutting a path through the cubicles. He didn't look at the secretaries or the junior associates. He looked like a man who was hunting. Elara felt a strange pull in her chest as she watched him. For the first time since she had gone undercover, she felt a flicker of genuine curiosity. She didn't know then that he was a wolf, and she didn't know that she was the prize he had been sent to claim. She only knew that for the first time in a long time, she wanted to be seen. Cale Viremont didn't just walk into a room, he commanded the air within it. As he moved through the logistics floor, the frantic clicking of keyboards slowed, and voices dropped to a hushed murmur. He was draped in a charcoal suit that looked like armor, his dark eyes scanning the rows of desks with a cold, analytical precision. He was the new efficiency consultant, a man hired to trim the fat from the company, yet he carried himself with the lethal grace of someone who lived by a much darker code. Elara kept her head down, her fingers moving rhythmically over her keyboard, but her pulse betrayed her. When he finally stopped at her desk, the shadow of his broad frame fell over her workspace, blocking out the sterile office lights. She looked up, and for a second the breath caught in her throat. His jawline was sharp enough to cut, and his eyes were a deep, fathomless brown that seemed to see right through her modest blouse and pinned-back hair. "You're Vance," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was a rich, low baritone that vibrated in the small space between them. "Yes, Mr. Viremont," she replied, keeping her voice soft and steady. "I have the Q3 audit reports ready for you." He didn't take the files she offered. Instead, he leaned down, placing one hand on the edge of her desk. The scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco reached her, a world away from the smell of burnt office coffee. "I've been watching the data," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her hands before returning to her eyes. "You're the only one in this department who doesn't make mistakes. Why is that?" Elara felt a flush creep up her neck. For months, she had been surrounded by men who looked at her as if she were part of the furniture. But Cale was looking at her as if she were a puzzle he was determined to solve. "I'd just like things to be in their right place," she said simply. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, not a kind smile, but one of genuine intrigue. "Precision is a rare trait, Elara. Most people are messy. They have too many feelings, too many distractions." He straightened up, his presence still looming. "I don't like mess. I think you and I are going to get along very well." As he walked away, Elara watched him go, her heart racing for a reason that had nothing to do with her secret. In that moment, she didn't see the undercover operative or the man who would eventually bet on her heart. She saw a man who finally seemed to recognize the intelligence she worked so hard to hide. She felt a dangerous spark of hope, a belief that in this vast, cold company, she had finally found someone who was her equal. It was the first time she felt the mask of the office mouse begin to slip, not because of power, but because of him. Cale's pursuit was not a storm. It was a slow, rising tide. Over the following weeks, he dismantled the walls Elara had spent months building with a surgical precision that terrified and thrilled her. He didn't offer her grand gestures that would have made her coworkers gossip. Instead, he offered her the one thing she lacked in her undercover life, a sense of being protected. It started with small, quiet moments. He would leave a high-end chocolate on her desk after a particularly grueling audit, or stay late in his glass-walled office until she finished her filing, ensuring she didn't have to walk to the parking lot alone. One rainy evening, as she struggled with a broken umbrella, he appeared beside her, his large black umbrella shielding her from the downpour. "A woman like you shouldn't have to fight the elements alone, Elara," he said, his voice dropping into that intimate, velvet register. In the dim light of the street lamps, his dark eyes held a warmth she truly believed was real. But every night, after dropping Elara off at the corner near her modest apartment, Cale's expression would shift from tender to tectonic. He would drive to a nondescript warehouse on the edge of the industrial district, where the air smelled of salt and rust. Inside, away from the polished glass of Vance Global, he sat across from men with scarred knuckles and heavy silences. "She's hooked," Cale told the shadowed figure at the head of the table, his voice devoid of the warmth he had used an hour prior. He tossed a thumb drive onto the table, internal logistics data he had pulled using Elara's login credentials while she was distracted by his gaze. "The office mouse is a goldmine of access. She trusts me implicitly. The bet is the least of our gains, but it keeps the boys motivated." Men laughed, a coarse, jagged sound. Cale joined them, his mind already calculating the next move in his game. He saw Elara as a series of vulnerabilities to be exploited, a soft target that would lead him to the heart of the Vance empire. Back at the office the next day, he leaned over her desk to show her a shortcut in the software, his hand briefly brushing against hers. Elara looked up at him, a genuine, shy smile touching her lips, thinking she had finally found a man who valued her for her mind and her presence. She didn't see the coldness behind his smile or the way he checked his watch, timing exactly how long it took for her to fall completely under his spell. To Elara, it was the beginning of a fairy tale. To Cale, it was just a job with a very lucrative finish line. The morning of the wedding was draped in an artificial perfection that Elara had almost allowed herself to believe. The cathedral was an architectural masterpiece of cold marble and towering, stained glass, filled with flowers that cost more than most people earned in a year. As she stood at the back of the aisle, clutching a bouquet of white roses, Elara felt a rare sense of peace. She had spent her life guarding a fortune and a name, but today she believed she was simply a woman giving herself to the man who truly saw her. When the heavy doors opened, she walked toward the altar with a grace that silenced the room. Cale stood at the front, looking every bit the commander in a perfectly tailored black suit. His expression was unreadable, his dark eyes fixed on her as she approached. Elara felt a surge of warmth, thinking his stoicism was merely a mask for the same nerves she felt. The ceremony proceeded like a dream until the minister reached the pivotal question. "Do you, Cale Viremont, take Elara Vance to be your lawfully wedded wife?" The silence that followed was too long. It stretched until it became heavy, then jagged. Cale didn't say, "I do." Instead, he let out a short, dry chuckle that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. He stepped back from Elara, putting a physical distance between them that felt like a chasm. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and held it toward the microphone on the pulpit. "Check the group chat, boys," Cale said, his voice flat and devoid of any of the tenderness he had used to woo her for months. "The funds should be in your accounts by now. $50,000 for the easiest mark in the city." A ripple of laughter broke out among the guests. Men Elara now realized were not Cale's friends, but his associates from the shadows. They held up their phones, recording her as the color drained from her face. "Cale," Elara whispered, her voice trembling. "What is this?" He looked at her then, and for the first time she saw the untouchable man without the filter of romance. His eyes were as cold as the marble beneath their feet. "It was a bet, Elara, to see if the office mouse actually had a heart to break. You were a project, a way to pass the time while I worked the logistics floor. Did you really think someone like me would settle for someone as plain as you?" The humiliation was visceral. The flashes from the phones felt like physical blows. The congregation, filled with people who had spent months watching them fall in love, was now a wall of voyeurs documenting her destruction. Elara stood still. She didn't scream, and she didn't beg. She felt the warmth in her chest die, replaced by a cold, hard clarity that she had suppressed for too long. She looked at Cale, really looked at him, and realized he had no idea whose house he was standing in. Without a single word, Elara turned. She didn't run. She walked down the aisle with her head held high, the train of her expensive lace gown sweeping over the petals strewn on the floor. She ignored the taunts, the laughter, and the glowing screens of the phones. She walked out of the cathedral and into the bright, unforgiving sunlight. As she reached the bottom of the stone steps, her personal driver, the one who usually stayed 2 blocks away, was waiting with the door of a black armored sedan open. She stepped inside, the heavy door closing with a dull thud that silenced the world. "MS. Vance?" the driver asked, looking at her through the rearview mirror. Elara pulled the pins from her hair, letting it fall around her shoulders as the office mouse persona crumbled. Her eyes were no longer soft. They were the eyes of a woman who owned everything. "Go to the office," she said, her voice like steel, "and call the board. I want Cale Viremont erased by sunset. The transition from the cathedral to the top floor of Vance Global took less than 20 minutes, but for Elara, it felt like crossing into a different lifetime." She sat in the back of the sedan, methodically wiping the bridal makeup from her face with a silk handkerchief. By the time the car pulled into the private underground executive bay, the last traces of the office mouse had been scrubbed away. She stepped out of the elevator on the 50th floor, still wearing the white lace wedding gown, though she had torn away the cumbersome veil. The sight of her sent a shockwave through the glass-walled lobby. The receptionists, who usually ignored the administrative staff, stood up instinctively. They didn't recognize the dress, but they recognized the look in her eyes, the cold, absolute authority of a Vance. Elara didn't stop to greet anyone. She pushed open the double oak doors of the grand boardroom, where the executive directors were already gathered in a state of confusion. They had been summoned for an emergency meeting with no explanation. The room went silent as Elara walked to the head of the table. She didn't sit down. She leaned forward, resting her palms on the polished mahogany, the white lace of her sleeves contrasting sharply with the dark wood. 6 months ago, I went into the logistics department to see if this company was being run by leaders or by predators, Elara said, her voice low and dangerous. Today, at my own wedding, I got my answer. Head of logistics, a man named Miller who had often laughed at Cale's jokes, turned a sickly shade of gray. Ms. Vance, Elara, we didn't know. The efficiency consultant, Viremont. He said exactly what you wanted to hear, Elara cut him off. You allowed a fox into the hen house because he made your numbers look better while he stepped on the people beneath him. You watched him humiliate an employee, and you did nothing because you thought she was nobody. She stood up straight, her silhouette framed by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. This company bears my father's name. It will no longer house his failures. As of this moment, the entire logistics management team is terminated. No severance, no recommendations. You can't fire all of us, Miller stammered, his voice cracking. The department will collapse. The syndicate contracts are being handed over to the authorities as we speak, Elara said, a ghost of a smile appearing on her face. It was the same intelligent, piercing look she had shown Cale before she left the church. I've spent 6 months documenting every illegal kickback and back-alley deal you thought Cale was helping you hide. You weren't working with a consultant, you were working with a spy, and I was the one watching the spy. She turned to her personal security chief, who stood by the door. Clear them out. Take their badges, their devices, and escort them to the curb. If they set foot on Vance property again, have them arrested for trespassing. As the security team began hauling the protesting executives out of the room, Elara finally sat in the high-backed leather chair at the head of the table. She looked down at her hands. She was still wearing the diamond ring Cale had bought with the money he'd made from the bet. She twisted it off and set it on the table. One more thing, she called out as Miller was being led away. Where is Cale Viremont? He went to his office to collect his things, Miller managed to choke out. Cancel his security clearance, Elara commanded. But don't throw him out yet. I want him to see exactly what he bet against. She was no longer the girl who wanted to be loved for herself. She was the woman who realized that in her world, power was the only thing that was real. The mask had dropped, and beneath it was a queen who was ready to go to war. Cale walked into the lobby of Vance Global with the swagger of a man who had just collected a massive bonus. He didn't feel guilty about the wedding. In his world, people were either assets or liabilities, and Elara had been a profitable asset. He adjusted his silk tie and headed toward the executive elevators, nodding to the security guard he had shared a drink with just last week. But when Cale tapped his keycard against the sensor, the light didn't turn green. Instead, a sharp red flash pulsed against the reader, followed by a low mechanical buzz. He tried again, frowning. Perhaps the system was glitching. Something wrong with these scanners? Cale asked, turning to the guard. The guard, who usually greeted him with a grin, now stood rigid, his eyes fixed on a point just above Cale's head. Your clearance has been revoked, Mr. Viremont. You are no longer permitted past the lobby. Cale's jaw tightened. Check again. I am the lead consultant for the logistics purge. I report directly to the board. The board didn't revoke it, a voice said from behind him. Cale turned to see 2 men in dark, tactical suits, Elara's personal security. The owner did. Cale let out a short, dry laugh. The owner is a ghost who hasn't stepped foot in this building in years. Call Miller. He'll straighten this out. Miller is currently being escorted out of the back entrance by the police, one of the men replied. And you're next. A cold prickle of unease finally broke through Cale's arrogance. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, intending to call his contacts in the syndicate. If the corporate side was falling apart, he needed to move his money immediately. He opened his banking app, his thumb hovering over the transfer button. His breath hitched. The balance displayed was 0. Not just his primary account, but his offshore holdings, his cleaner fees, and the $50,000 he had boasted about at the altar. Every penny was gone, replaced by a single message in the transaction history. The bet is settled. Cale felt the world tilt. He tried to dial his handler, but his phone service had been disconnected. Even the high-end device, which was technically a company asset, was being remotely wiped as he held it. The screen went black, reflecting his own shocked, pale face. This isn't possible, he muttered, his voice losing its commanding edge. She was just an assistant. She didn't have the access. Had all the access, the security guard said, finally looking him in the eye. There was no pity there, only a strange kind of satisfaction. You spent 6 months trying to find the CEO's weakness, Cale. You never realized you were dating her. Realization hit Cale like a physical blow. He thought of the quiet woman who had made him sandwiches, the office mouse, who had listened to his stories with wide, admiring eyes. He had shared his login details, his habits, and his secrets with her, thinking he was the one in control. Every move he had made to infiltrate the company had been a roadmap he handed directly to the woman who owned it. The security team stepped forward, their hands resting on their holsters. "You have 30 seconds to leave the premises, or we'll have you detained for industrial espionage and fraud. The evidence of your mafia ties has already been sent to the federal prosecutor." Cale stood in the middle of the gleaming marble lobby, the very heart of the empire he thought he had conquered. For the first time in his life, he felt small. He had no money, no phone, and no allies. He had walked into the building as a king and was being cast out as a common thief. As he was pushed through the revolving doors and onto the crowded sidewalk, he looked up at the towering glass spire. Somewhere up there, Elara was watching. He had bet $50,000 that he could break her heart, but she had countered by destroying his entire world without saying a single word. Desperation is a powerful motivator. By nightfall, Cale was a man possessed by a volatile mixture of rage and disbelief. He didn't have his keycard, but he knew the building's secondary service entrances, knowledge he had gained back when he thought he was the one playing the spy. He bypassed a faulty sensor in the loading dock and navigated the service stairs, his lungs burning as he climbed. He had to see her. He had to look into her eyes and find the woman who had cried at his fake romantic poems, the woman he was sure he could still manipulate. When he finally forced open the heavy doors to the executive penthouse, the office was dim, lit only by the sprawling glow of the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling glass. The room was vast, smelling of expensive leather and old money. Cale marched toward the massive mahogany desk, his breath coming in jagged gasps. "Elara." "Enough with the games," he shouted into the shadows. "I don't know how you hacked my accounts, but you're going to fix this. Now." The high-backed leather chair behind the desk slowly rotated. Elara was sitting there, framed by the moonlight. She was no longer wearing the white lace gown. She had changed into a tailored black silk suit that made her look like part of the night. Her hair was down, flowing over her shoulders, and her expression was so calm it was terrifying. She wasn't hiding in the corner of a cubicle anymore. She looked like she had been born sitting in that chair. "You're trespassing, Cale," she said. Her voice was steady, lacking the shy tremor he had grown used to. "And after the day I've had, I'm not in a very patient mood." Cale stopped a few feet from the desk, his bravado wavering. Up close, the softness he had banked on was gone. Her eyes were piercing, cold, and incredibly intelligent. "Who are you?" he hissed. "The girl I met worked in logistics. She lived in a one-bedroom apartment on 4th Street. I saw your life, Elara. It was pathetic." "The girl you met was an observation," Elara replied, leaning forward into the light. "The apartment was a lease. The job was a test. And you, Cale, were the most predictable result I've ever seen. You didn't fall in love with me because you don't know how to love anything that doesn't serve your ego. You saw a target, and I let you see exactly what you wanted." Cale reached across the desk, trying to grab her arm, but Elara didn't flinch. She didn't even move. A red laser dot appeared on the center of Cale's chest, steady and unmoving. He froze, his hand trembling inches from her sleeve. "My security team is much faster than you are," she said softly. "And unlike you, they are actually loyal." Cale's face contorted. "You think you've won. The syndicate doesn't just let people walk away with their money. They'll come for you. They'll burn this building to the ground. They're already coming for you, Cale." Elara countered. She slid a tablet across the desk. On the screen was a live feed of the warehouse where he had reported to his mafia handlers. It was surrounded by federal agents. "I didn't just take your money. I took your leverage. You failed your mission, you lost their investment, and you led the authorities right to their doorstep. To them, you aren't a high-ranking operative anymore. You're a liability." Cale looked at the screen, then back at the woman he had called the office mouse. Reality of his situation finally settled in his gut-like lead. He had spent months trying to lure her into a trap, never realizing he was the one walking into a cage. Why? he whispered, his voice finally breaking. Why go through all of this just for a bet? It wasn't about the bet, Cale, Elara said, standing up. She looked down at him, her silhouette imposing and regal. It was about showing you that you never had the power you thought you did. You didn't marry a victim. You married the person who owns the ground you're standing on. Now, get out of my office before I decide to let the syndicate find you. Cale stumbled out of the Vance Global building and into the cold night air, his mind reeling. Every shadow seemed to move, every passing car felt like a threat. He knew how the syndicate operated. In their eyes, he hadn't just failed a mission, he had become a beacon for the authorities. He had led the law to their doorstep, and for a shadow organization, that was a death sentence. He tried to disappear into the city, but without money or a working phone, he was a ghost in a world he no longer controlled. By the time he reached the outskirts of the warehouse district, he saw the black SUVs idling at the corners. They weren't police. They were his own people. A man stepped out from the lead vehicle, Victor, a high-ranking enforcer who had never liked Cale's arrogance. "Boss isn't happy, Cale," Victor said, his voice flat as he leaned against the door. "You were supposed to be the best. Instead, you got played by a girl in a lace dress. You've cost us millions in seized assets tonight." "I can fix it," Cale said, his voice cracking. "I just need time to get back into the system." Victor pulled a silenced pistol from his waistband, his expression bored. "There is no more system for you. You're the loose end we're here to tie up." Cale didn't think. He ran. He dove into an alleyway, the silent puff of a bullet hitting the brickwork behind his head. He scrambled over fences and through narrow passages, his heart thundering in his chest. He realized then that there was only one place in the city where the syndicate couldn't reach him, the one fortress they hadn't been able to crack. He doubled back toward the city center, his clothes torn and his face bruised from a fall. He reached the gates of the Vance estate just as the sun began to peek over the horizon. The security team met him at the perimeter, pinning him to the ground before he could say a word. "Please," Cale gasped, his face pressed into the gravel. "Tell her. Tell her they're coming for me. Tell her I am sorry." Minutes later, he was dragged into the estate's study. Elara was standing by a window, a cup of tea in her hand, looking out at the waking city. She didn't turn around when they threw him onto the rug. Cale looked up at her, the untouchable man now reduced to a trembling wreck. "Elara, please, they're outside. Victor is out there. If I leave this house, I am a dead man." Elara finally turned. She looked at him with a profound sense of pity, the kind one might feel for a broken toy. "You spent 6 months pretending to be my protector, Cale, and now here you are begging for mine." "Give you everything," Cale pleaded, his pride completely evaporated. "I'll testify. I'll give you the names, the bank accounts, the routes. Just don't let them take me." "You have nothing to give me that I haven't already taken," Elara said softly, setting her tea down on a side table. She walked over to him, looking down at the man who had mocked her at the altar. "But I'm not like you, Cale. I don't use people until they break and then throw them away." She looked at her security chief. "Put him in the safe room. Call our legal team and the federal task force. If he wants to live, he's going to spend the rest of his life making sure every one of his friends ends up in a cell." Cale let out a sob of pure relief, his forehead touching the floor. He was safe, but he was shattered. He had spent his life thinking power was about who you could crush. As he was led away, he finally understood that real power was about who you had the strength to save, even if they didn't deserve it. The months following the collapse of the syndicate and the removal of the logistics team were the quietest the city had known in years. Elara Vance no longer walked through the service entrance or hid her radiance behind muted colors. She moved through the halls of Vance Global with a measured, graceful pace, her presence commanding a natural respect that had nothing to do with fear. The office was different now. The culture of quiet bullying and predatory competition had been replaced by a standard of integrity that started from the very top. Elara had spent weeks overseeing the total cleansing of her company. Every executive who had turned a blind eye to Cale's manipulation was gone, replaced by people she had handpicked during her time undercover. The quiet workers who had shown her kindness when they thought she was nobody. She realized that her father's warning had been true, but she had taken it a step further. She didn't just find someone who saw her. She had built a world where being seen was a requirement, not a risk. In the city, the ripples of her power were felt everywhere. The syndicate's influence had been systematically dismantled, their bank accounts drained and redirected toward community foundations and youth programs. The warehouse district was being rezoned for affordable housing, and the dark corners where men like Victor once operated were now flooded with light. Elara didn't just own the buildings. She was reclaiming the soul of the streets they stood on. One evening, Elara stood on the balcony of her penthouse, looking out over the sprawling lights of the metropolis. She was dressed in a simple but expensive navy silk gown, her hair flowing freely in the cool breeze. The weight of the crown no longer felt heavy. It felt right. She heard the soft sound of footsteps behind her and didn't need to turn to know who it was. Her new security chief waited at a respectful distance. "The federal proceedings are finalized, Ms. Vance," he said quietly. "Cale Viremont has been relocated under the Witness Protection Program. He'll be testifying against the remaining syndicate heads for the next several years. He'll never be able to use his real name again." Elara nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "He wanted to be untouchable," she mused. "Now he's invisible, it's a fitting end." She thought back to the girl in the white lace dress who had stood at the altar, feeling her heart break in front of 1,000 cameras. That girl was gone, but Elara didn't regret her. That heartbreak had been the fire that forged the woman she was today. She had lost a fake marriage, but she had gained her own life. She had learned that being soft wasn't a weakness, it was a choice, one that she could now make on her own terms. Elara turned back toward her office, the glass reflecting a woman who was radiant, intelligent, and entirely whole. She had gone undercover to find love, but she had ended up finding herself. As she sat back down in the power chair, she picked up a pen and signed the first of many new initiatives. The reign of the secret CEO was over. The era of Elara Vance had begun, and this time, the whole world was watching. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to this channel to keep getting more of our stories.